Brooksman Professor in Irish and Scottish Studies at the University of Aberdeen. However, as of January 2006, he will hold the Sir William Fraser Chair of Scottish History at the University of Edinburgh. Among his many honors is that he's a Fellow of the British Academy, the Royal Society of Edinburgh, the Royal Irish Academy, and the Royal History Society. He began his academic career at the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow. But I'm happy to say he hasn't spent all his time in Scotland because he has taught at University of North Carolina in the United States, and at the University of Guelph in Ontario. You might think from all of this that he wouldn't have published so extensively, but listen to he has published very extensively. His first book was on the Tobacco Lords, Ireland and Scotland, 1600 to 1850. Which it's a book that I really am very interested in having a good look at, because it makes the point of that the Virginia tobacco farmers in the mid-Atlantic United States were really capitalized by Scottish tobacco lords. Book on the Scottish firm in Virginia, People and Society in Scotland, the Great Highland Famine, Scottish Emigration and Scottish Society. It's very relevant to his talk here today on the menace of the Irish race to our Scottish nationality. Scotland's campaign against Irish immigration is his book entitled Scotland's Shame, Bigotry and Sectarianism in Modern Scotland and Scotland's Empire. At the beginning of the year, Professor Devine was created an officer of the British Empire, which is why he has the OBE after his name. Book which you might want to have a look at here, his book on the Scottish nation. It outsold Harry Potter, and that is really saying. And with that, please come, Professor Devine. I'm looking forward very much to hearing you.
Thank you very much for that. Well, I'm only outsold Harry Potter in Scotland and for 2 weeks. I'm only a semi-millionaire, not a multi-millionaire. Thanks very much for those generous introductory remarks. This, in a sense, is the core document which will form the basis of this presentation this afternoon. It was published in that year, you can see, by a subcommittee of the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland. Those of you who are unfamiliar with that particular organisation should know that the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland still is the supreme governing agency of what is Scotland's largest, by far Scotland's largest Protestant grouping, and in fact Presbyterianism in Scotland is still by far the dominant form of Christian religion, although as in the United States and elsewhere there has been an erosion over time of affiliation and attendance. The thing you need to know about this organisation primarily is that in a sense it really spoke for Scotland, not simply in the religious sphere, but if you like, in the political sphere and also in a sense in the moral sphere. Because until just a few years ago, Scotland had no parliament since the union with England in 1707. Theoretically, both the Westminster and the Edinburgh parliaments disappeared, and a new assembly was created, which of course was located in London. We now have a new Scottish devolved parliament in Edinburgh, which is attracting varying views thus far in terms of its performance. But the point I'm trying to get at is this: the General Assembly was almost a kind of substitute parliament for the Scots because of the range of things on which it spoke. So what I'm really saying to you before I get into the significance of this document and what emanated from it and what caused it to be published is that it's coming from a very important source in Scottish society, one which is likely to be a representation of important Scottish opinion and a very powerful influencer of this is, I don't know if you all see that relatively clearly. If you can't, I'll go through some of the basic notions, the basic arguments which is in this. This is the first page of this tract, The Menace of the Irish Race to Our Scottish Nationality, which was submitted to the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland and was warmly welcomed, in fact applauded, by that body in the early 1920s. There are a number of points to be made about this first page, which of course some of the issues, some of the generalities are developed further as the document goes on. Very interestingly, it doesn't necessarily represent a specific attack upon the Catholic religion by this Protestant nation. You see the emphasis is on racial differentiation. The point is particularly made that we are not opposed to our indigenous Catholics, probably about 5% of the Scottish population, mainly in the northeast lowlands of Scotland and in some parts of the Western Highlands, were traditional Catholics, pre-Reformation, a kind of continuity from pre-16th century religious society in Scotland. Emphatically said here and throughout the document, they are not our enemies. The second thing which is interesting is they specifically exempt what they call the orange population from the critique. Now, by the orange population, they mean the small, small by this stage in terms of immigration, but in the middle decades of the 19th century, the substantial minority of immigrants from Ireland who were Protestant. Remember, Scotland's Irish immigration came overwhelmingly from the northern counties of Ireland, and a substantial part of it came from Antrim and Down. So what we have is a duality in terms of the immigrant stream. Probably at the census of 1851, something of the order of maybe 2/3 to around 4/5, sometimes it's very difficult to differentiate, were Catholic, obviously Catholic, but the remainder, a substantial minority, were Protestant. They were recognised to be Irish, at least in the first, maybe even the second generation, but they were our co-religionaries, so this tract, this pamphlet had it. And again, we don't have any real concern about them. The enemy, which is differentiated here and isolated here, ladies and gentlemen, are Irish Catholic immigrants to Scotland, who are being vigorously criticised, not directly for reasons of religious affiliation, but for reasons of racial difference. And this is going to be one of the themes running through this presentation, which is something emphatically new in Irish immigrant, Indigenous Scots relationships in the period of mass Irish migration to Scotland over the late 18th, 19th and early 20th centuries. The basis of the attack is the scale of Irish immigration is such that it's likely to undermine the purity of the Scottish race. The Irish, the Catholic Irish, so the perception runs throughout this document, are responsible for criminality, debauchery, improvidence, intemperance, which is unusual given the Scottish tradition in that area, and many other crimes. The word pollution is used throughout the document. The pollution of the Irish, the pollution of the Scottish race by what is regarded by the authors of this document, remember, serious professional people, senior clergy in the Church of Scotland, addressing the highest court, at least highest religious court, in the land. The emphasis is very much that this is almost a kind of sub-race, that this is a kind of inferior race who, due to the scale of its immigration into Scotland, is going to have profoundly deleterious and disastrous effects on the society. Now, one of the things that I do in history, in fact, one of the only things that really drives me, is to explain apparent puzzles, apparent conundrum, issues which don't seem on the surface of the process of development to be easily explicable. If you broaden the context out here from this document in the early 1920s, in the context of the whole run of Irish migration to Scotland, it seems distinctly eccentric and odd, and indeed unexpected. If we go back to the period from the 1790s to 1914, Scotland, I can actually put up the numbers, which might be a better idea than simply to rehearse them orally in detail. That's the kind of order of magnitude of first generation Irish migration to Scotland. The movement starts to become apparent from the 1790s. It probably reaches a peak, not actually during the famine, for reasons I can talk about in discussion if you wish, but really in the 1860s, 1870s, 1880s. The interesting thing is you'll see that although in absolute terms, Irish migration to Scotland is more limited than to England, in per capita terms, the movement of Irish to Scotland is actually greater. And what gives it a greater intensity of location is the spatial dimensions associated with the movement. Overwhelmingly, you will find, even to this day, the descendants of this immigrant population in three major areas in Scotland. The first is West Central Lowland Scotland, the 5 counties around the Glasgow conurbation, facing, if you like, across the sea to Ulster. The second is West Lothian, which is just outside Edinburgh, and which was one of the favourite loci of the immigrant Ulster Scots, the immigrant Presbyterian Irish. And to this day, it's almost a centre of excellence for the Orange Lodge in Scotland, which is, of course, tracing its lineage right back to these early migrant movements of the Victorian and Edwardian eras. And then finally, a very specific movement to Dundee, one of the 4 Scottish cities. Interestingly, overwhelmingly female in the 1820s, 30s and 40s, because it was driven by the seductive prospects of working in the jute industry as spinners and associated activities. And throughout the 19th century, the Dundee jute girl, the Dundee mill girl, was a formidable force, not only in the home, but also in the area of trade union development in that period. Now, what we're talking about here is the response of the indigenous population. So to put the 1920s, the vitriol of the 1920s in context, let's look at the situation from the 1790s through until the end of the Great War, to the end of World War I. And look at it very briefly because of time constraint in comparative context. What I'm looking for here is evidences of difference or similarity through the response, particularly through violent response of indigenous populations to mass Irish migration. Now, if you look at the Scottish experience between the last quartile of the 18th century and the first decade of the 20th century, there is absolutely no evidence whatsoever of the kind of nativist reaction that one experiences in the USA with the Know Nothing movement and the violence associated with famine and migration. And if you compare it to the situation which has recently been deciphered by a number of scholars for Liverpool, to a lesser extent Manchester and London, even in a comparative British context, the Scottish response, although not in any way welcoming, is free of that kind of mass movement or mass movements of resistance, and certainly free of intensive rioting resulting in levels of mortality. There's been a fair amount of work done specifically on the difference between Liverpool and Glasgow in this respect. And Glasgow is always identified, in quote marks at least, as the more peaceful city of the two. One of the great ironies, which I might have time to come to during the presentation, but if not during discussion, is that in Scotland, and in particular in the Glasgow and West Central Scotland area, there is still a powerful perception of a sectarian problem which has long disappeared from Liverpool. The Scottish Executive to this day has an anti-sectarian strategy, possibly the only governmental agency in classical areas of Irish Catholic settlement in the world, including this Australia and Australasia, including this Australasia as well as the USA, which still has a public strategy to try and combat sectarianism based on Catholic and Protestant differentiation and tension. But that's a later story. You do get concern in the early 1850s. You do get reaction to such demagogues as the former priest Alessandro Gavazzi, who tours the Glasgow, Greenock and Paisley areas as a demagogue virtually, denouncing Catholicism, having experienced it as a former priest. The notorious angel Gabriel, one John Sayers Orr, is involved in the same kind of practices. So you're finding a bit of fisticuffs going on. You're also finding, of course, we could tell us from the Catholic diocesan and archdiocesan archives, that in no way, at least in most quarters, is this poor immigrant group visibly welcomed. They may be welcomed by some employers, but by and large Scottish society puts up with them. But there's an interesting comparator comes through again with the English situation. Some of you may recall that when the English Catholic hierarchy is restored in the early 1850s, it leads to, and again I use this word, Rufan, it leads to massive recalcitrance on the part, this is a private joke you've got, it leads to massive truculence and recalcitrance in England for a period. When the Scottish Catholic hierarchy is restored in 1872, nothing happens. There's some comment in the press, but very little. I'm conscious of that great man who wrote The Children of the Dead End and The Rat Pit, and his famous statement when he called Scotland the black land with the cold heart. He was originally a seasonal migrant from Donegal, and then eventually he became a navvy working on some of the big reservoirs in the north of Scotland. So he certainly saw the sharp end of Scottish prejudice. But so far as we can tell at this period of, if you like, research knowledge, so far as we can tell, such violence as existed was really intra-Irish rather than Indigenous Scots versus Irish. By that I mean that the classic fora for such physical activity, it tended to be the 12th of July and associated events, when, because of the way employment was structured in Scotland, with managers, bosses and contractors going to the north of Ireland and recruiting and settling people in virtually mono-religious industrial settlements and villages. I mean, I could take you around the county of Lanark, the county of Lanarkshire, one of the old classic industrialised parts of the west central Scotland, maybe with about 24 towns which boomed in the 19th century, and still to this day they have either an orange or a Catholic hue to them. That's not to say there hasn't been intermobility, but there is still that kind of sense of whether they are supporters of Glasgow Rangers or Glasgow Celtic, which is the new totemic differentiating point in Scotland rather than religiosity. So, what I'm really saying to you is this. In terms of Indigenous response, and especially in terms of this racial analysis, it's really unknown, and it's certainly unknown for a respectable organisation like the Church of Scotland to respond in this particular way. What's also very intriguing about the issue, in terms of trying to deepen the apparent paradox or puzzle, as a government investigation revealed in the early 1930s, partly in response to this kind of stuff, Irish migration to Scotland has descended to the veriest trickle. To the veriest trickle. So the irony is that there was actually no mass Irish migration to Scotland in the interwar period. In fact, Ireland's great movement into Scotland this has been sporadic movement since, ended just before and during the First World War. And the reason was obvious. Scotland no longer had the economic attractiveness it had in the past. There's no experience in post-1945 Scotland of the in-migration of Irish that you find in the 1940s, 50s and 60s, now being, if you like, reversed in the heartlands of industrial Scotland. So it's actually at the tail end of the great exodus from the island of Ireland to Scotland that there seems to be, among influential circles in Scotland, serious concern about this movement. We can deepen the issue further in another way. If you look at which you probably will not do, but having looked myself at elements of the Scottish press during the Great War of 1914-18, this immigrant group are applauded regularly in opinion columns for their contribution to the national war effort. No less than 6 Victoria Crosses. The Victoria Cross is the highest honour for bravery. To give you an example, only 3 have been awarded to British soldiers over the last 32 years. It's a very, very rare honour for valour. 6 members of the first generation immigrant community in the west of Scotland were honoured with Victoria Crosses during the First World War. The Archbishops of Glasgow and Edinburgh regularly blessed the war as a just cause. The Catholic newspaper of the time, the Herald newspaper, also came out regularly to say that we must keep going. The losses are horrendous, but we must keep going in order to achieve final victory. So, if you like, the community gets not only a very good press immediately before this pamphlet was published, but not simply in perception, but in substantive terms, looks well on the way to affiliation, well on the way to assimilation. They don't look any longer, as they might have done in earlier decades, strangers in the proverbial strange land. And what seems to reinforce that reality, ladies and gentlemen, is what is still called the Magna Carta of Scottish Catholic education in my country. And that is the passing in the year 1918 of Section 8 of the 19 Education Act. It is regarded as, in a sense, as the real basis of the social mobility, the social improvement of those masses who came from Ireland to look for a better life. By the 1918 Education Act, Section 8, the schools that they had tried great sacrifice to support throughout the areas of immigrant settlement, but were almost inevitably inferior in staffing, resources and buildings to the rest of the, if you want to call it, the public sector. I remember it was like tremendous historical ethos in Scotland about education. It was a real marker of the nation, that the way forward for any human being was by maximising the abilities of the mind. And that's still a very prominent part of the Scottish ethos, the Scottish psyche. By that piece of legislation, and in a sense it could have been expected given the new and very positive relationships between the community and the indigenous host elements. Not only were these Irish Catholic parishes relieved of that financial burden, the schools became part of the state system, but with 3 major privileges. The first, Catholic clergy would have a right of entry for the purposes of catechizing or whatever. Secondly, the Catholic Church would have a significant role over the appointment of teachers. And thirdly, in the same documentation, the curriculum would have to satisfy the hierarchy, especially in the area of education, what was called the education of religion or morals. It would be interesting to find out, and I know this doesn't happen in the USA, But it'd be interesting to find out whether you know, even in continental Europe, of a system which was so generous to what was basically, in most of its respects, an underclass element in the Scottish nation. Having looked at some of the comparative occupational patterns between areas of Irish settlement in the States and areas of Irish settlement in the UK, and particularly in Scotland, there's clear evidence of occupational improvement on this side of the Atlantic compared to the relative stasis, right through probably even until the 40s and 50s, of the Irish immigrant community in Scotland, and indeed also in parts of England. And of course, this was in a sense the thinking, ladies and gentlemen, behind the Liberal government's proposals. They thought that if they did not improve the lot of what by that time was nearly 700,000 Catholics, most of them from an Irish background, then they would become a kind of pariah class, that they would become a threat to social stability and order. They had to be brought within the collective ethos of old Scotia, which was going right back to the Reformation times, to give every human being, and including by this time girls, a right to a good education on the basis of ability. It was a ruthless system because it was not based on any kind of comprehensive notion of teaching. It was based on the simple criterion of intellectual ability, and that lasted in Scotland right through to the 1960s by rigorous testing at primary school level before you were separated out into the various cadres of secondary education, whether from the prestigious, which would allow you to go into an academic education at university, or in other areas. So the basic question is this, or questions rather, the two questions that I want to pose in relation to this issue is, why is it particularly at this time, in the early 1920s, and it lasts for much longer than that, is there this strong nativist, based on some kind of crude racial analysis? Why particularly at this time, rather than at the height of the inward movement of Irish? Does this, really in a sense, especially when you consider what's happening in continental Europe at the time, almost sinister attack, isolating it from its origin, from its orange compatriots, if you like, from the Protestant Irish, separating it out even from indigenous Catholics in Scotland. And then producing a programme which, although it never became part of the official programme of the Church of Scotland, did involve this discussion, serious discussion of mass deportation of first-generation individuals from this ethnic group. Secondly, and this did form part of the formal programme, secondly, people of Irish origin, interestingly enough, Irish origin, by that they meant the so-called Scoto-Irish, second, third, fourth generation, because some of them had families been in the country since the early 19th century. If they were if they were in a poorhouse, if they were in what we would now call public welfare, if they were in hospital or in prisons, they should also be instantly deported. There should be constraints. Remember, this is the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland's official view in the early 1920s, going right through to the beginning of the Second World War. There should be an embargo, if not an embargo, then a serious constraint on the number of Irish coming in to Scotland. And only recently has this whole set of issues been opened up by modern scholars, as you can imagine, to the astonishment of very many modern Scots, that this actually happened sometimes during the lifetimes of people who were still alive in Scotland in the 1980s and 1990s. Such was the response, or the horrific response to this, that 3 years ago, in a solemn statement, the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland solemnly apologised to the Roman Catholic community in Scotland for these attacks, for this form of racialist abuse of the 1920s and 1930s. From that document and its acceptance in 1921, officers of the Assembly met the Secretary of State for Scotland on 4 occasions. On 2 occasions they met the Home Secretary in the British government. On 1 occasion the issue of controlling Irish immigration was debated in the British cabinet in the early 1930s. Alongside the, if you like, this formal and very vigorous response to what was perceived as a menace, as a threat, there does grow up in Scotland much greater evidence of sectarian tensions in the interwar period. Let me just give you 3 examples of it. The first is the foundation in Edinburgh and Glasgow, the 2 major Scottish cities, of sectarian political groups, one called Protestant Action and the other the Scottish Protestant League. One led by a man called Alexander Ratcliffe, the other by a man called John Cormack. These groups had even greater support in Scotland than the Mosleyites, led by Sir Oswald Mosley and his semi-fascist organisations. In the year 1931, Scottish Protestant Action gained no less than 1/3 of the popular vote in Glasgow, the Glasgow local elections. 3 years later, its Edinburgh equivalent came very close to gaining 1/3 of the popular vote. And it was argued by some who were opposed to this dynamic in Scotland, that what the Church of Scotland had done, although it didn't participate directly in these, if you like this kind of street politics, it had powerfully legitimised these crazed people on the streets, and therefore, for that reason, the Church often was condemned by some elements of respectable Scottish opinion in the press. That's the first indication that the thing was seeping out from, if you like, a formal relationship between churchmen and government into the mainstream of Scottish society. The second is what I, in a sense, referred to briefly earlier. It's the beginnings of that great sporting conflict between the 2 ethnic and religious champions, soccer, in the soccer area, in the football area. It is amazing to reflect that if you look at the Scottish sport literature of the 1890s, there is no evidence at all, and both clubs have been formed by then, Glasgow Rangers and Glasgow Celtic. There is no evidence of any serious animosity, and certainly no evidence of any sectarian animosity in the 1890s, early 1900s. By the 1920s, the classic Rangers policy of not employing Catholics or those who were married to Catholics is in place under the managership of a man called Bill Struth. And that policy lasts right through until the late 1980s, when a football player called Maurice Johnson, the product of a mixed marriage, was hired by Rangers. And there is clear evidence from football reports in the 1920s and 1930s that the sectarian poison has started to enter, has started to penetrate the relationship. Celtic have become unambiguously the champions of the Irish Catholic immigrant class. Rangers have become unambiguously the champions of the Orange Irish immigrant class, and also elements drawn from the indigenous Protestants of Scotland. And then finally there's the issue of gangland. There's very little reports about, if you like, collective gang activity in late 19th, early 20th century Scotland, and that's probably because really historians haven't looked for it. So the whole gang culture in Scottish urban areas, particularly in the urban areas of the West, tends to date from the interwar period. At least it's documented from that period. And in the great city of Glasgow, which of course is the dominant industrial dynamo of Scotland in the 19th and early 20th centuries, you begin to get gangs emerging like the Billy Boys. Hello, hello, we are the Billy Boys. Hello, hello, we are the Billy Boys. And it goes on something like, we're up to the knees in Fenian blood, surrender all you'll die, because we are the Brigton Billy Boys. That song is still sung at Scottish football parks to this day. If any of you have ever visited soccer and especially soccer between these two so-called Glasgow giants. You'll hear songs like that being sung, despite the Scottish Executive trying to teach them to be more, quote, civilised, unquote. So what I'm really saying to you is this. If Scotland has a period of sectarian bitterness, it's not the period of mass migration, and especially not the period as I think it probably was here in the immediate famine or post-famine period, or the period that Liverpool had it, which was the 1880s and 1890s. It was much more modern than that. It was in the 1920s and 1930s. And one explanation, there are others which one could come up with, but one explanation why there is still the remnants, and I don't want to exaggerate this, because things like job discrimination have long gone, but why there is some remnants of what I would term attitudinal sectarianism in Scotland is because of this serious crisis in the 1920s and 1930s. Why does it happen? Well, what I want to do now is to try and come to that basic issue, and then for the last few minutes, in a sense, in a set of concluding remarks, try to engage with a much more speculative question. What if any, are the relationships between these events, which are of not simply of antiquarian interest, but what are the relationship between those events in the 20s and 30s and the development of modern Scotia, the development of modern Scotland in the later 19th and indeed, later 20th and indeed into the early 20th century. Inevitably my explanation for this, because of the time factor, will have to be a bit formulaic, really in terms of a kind of overview rather than a detailed exploration of the various areas. But what I would begin with is, when it's not a sufficient explanation, for reasons I'll go into in a few seconds, but what I would begin to do is to say that accompanying and coincidental with this sectarian dimension, a dimension which even involved the Church of Scotland making contact with the International Protestant League in Berlin in the early 1930s, a defence mechanism for international Protestantism against popery, where it was agreed in discussion that the problem of the Judenfrage in Germany was equivalent to the problem of the Irishenfrage in Scotland, and therefore Scottish Presbyterian clerics should not protest about the Jewish issue in Germany because they had the beginnings of a similar issue in Scotland. The correlation does seem to be between Scotland's greatest social crisis of modern times, and by modern times I mean really since the Industrial Revolution, and these events. That correlation is at the heart of my own explanation, but in itself it's not a sufficient explanation for reasons I'll come to as my analysis proceeds. What was the nature of that social crisis? The nature of it was this. West Central Scotland was notorious throughout the world as the workshop of the British Empire. It was heavily geared to the global market across a whole range of activities: shipbuilding, heavy engineering, steel manufacture, iron manufacture. You can still see engines built by the North British Locomotive Company, the greatest locomotive engineering company in the world, still on the Indian railway system to this day. It produced, especially among the mercantile and business classes, an attitude of almost arrogance. Glasgow proclaimed itself the second city in the British Empire. What happens in the 20s is almost like a trajectory from a blue sky. That whole system crumbles. The number of ships launched in the Clyde, remember the Clyde River had launched 2/5 of all commercial vessels in the world in the year 1911. The number of ships launched in the Clyde falls by 50% between the mid-20s and the early 30s. In some of the classic industrial areas like Airdrie, Coatbridge, Motherwell, Hamilton, you're talking about unemployed levels reaching 30 to 35%. in the early 1930s. And remember, the heavy industrial economy, because of its export orientation, had been used to fluctuation, had been used to volatility. This was nothing new. What was entirely new and caused total confusion, total anxiety, and certainly a very complex series of almost panic reactions among the Scottish entrepreneurial classes, why was it going on for over a decade? It seemed as if this was the end of Scotland's ancient economic supremacy. And the worry about what was to come, the anxiety nationally about what was to come, was profound. That wasn't the only factor. Between 1914 and 1918, the Scottish reputation for martial valour came home to roost. The Highland regiments, and it's still the same in the British Army today, are the elite regiments of the British Army. You think of the famous names, Black Watch, Gordon Highlanders, Argyll and Southern Highlanders. The real cutting edge of empire. Internationally renowned for their ferocity. Because of that, they were constantly used as shock troops in those horrendous battles between 1914 and 1918. The result of that was that the Scottish losses between 1914 and 1918 were third only to the losses of the Serbs and the Turks. The losses of the Serbs and the Turks in terms of per capita mortality. But we now know that those other nations lost primarily through disease. The Scottish losses were primarily through regiments being decimated at places like the Somme, Mons, the Dardanelles, etc. And if you go around Scotland to this day, even in the smallest hamlet, a hamlet perhaps with only 50, 100 people living, they will all have their First World War monument. Because you see, these regiments were raised territorially, and sometimes an entire cohort, an entire age group in a locality was wiped out. And then the third devastation was emigration. Professor Harris was at a presentation I gave in another institution a few days ago when I was remarking that if you take an international league table of emigration, when we can measure it from the 1850s, the top three in terms of per capita loss were Ireland, Norway and Scotland. And normally Ireland was at the top, Norway second and Scotland third, although sometimes, for example, in the 1870s, 1890s and the early 1900s, you begin to get complexity moving up and down. For the first time since Professor Dudley Baines at the LSE calculated that, taking it from the 1850s onwards among 16 different European regions, Scotland became the international capital of emigration in the 1920s. Between 1921, the census of 1921, and the census of 1941, it lost 463,000 people. That's a nation of just below 5 million. For the first time in recorded history, the population of the country actually fell. Ironically enough, the vast majority came here. And ironically enough as well, a goodly substantial minority of them were first-generation Irish immigrants to Scotland, who then moved on to the USA, protesting about the black land with the coal tar, from which they were leaving for a better life on trusted market. So what I'm saying to you is this, that I think one possible correlation is the social crisis produced such a level of anxiety, concern, or even panic, not simply in Scottish society, but among the Scottish elites, that we did, or the nation did start to move into scapegoating. Did start to look for the strangers, those who were different. But interestingly enough, it wasn't the Jews. There was a substantial Jewish population into parts of Scotland. It wasn't the Italians, except when Mussolini declared war in 1949. You had a kind of Scottish Kristallnacht with Italian fish and chip shops and cafes being attacked. It wasn't even the Lithuanians
who were massing also in some of the Scottish coalfields. Those who were marked out were the Catholic Irish. And it's this intriguingly racist dimension which is important. The racist dimension seems to have been there really from the middle decades of the 19th century. It had never really been activated in the way it was in the 1920s. But some of the really influential racist thinkers in Europe in 1850s, the 1860s were Scots. I don't know if you recall the famous Burke and Hare trial of the 1820s, when they instead of getting bodies for an anatomical research from the local cemeteries, Burke and Hare actually started to kill people in order to produce bodies for the surgeon. The surgeon for whom they worked was called Dr. Andrew Knox. And in the 1850s, long after one of them had been hung, Andrew Knox became one of the most celebrated British racists. And he was still based in Edinburgh, in his Races of Man, which became a very important influential text. He was joined by several other Scottish authors of the period, and the big differentiation that they made in terms of inferior and superior races was between the Teutonic race, superior, that's Lowland Scots by and large, and Celtic races, inferior, that's Irish and Gaels, Highland Scots. And there was a Highland potato famine, not unlike that of the Irish, except it lasted for 10 years, with very limited mortality. Nothing in any scale like the Irish one, although huge levels of emigration from the stricken areas. But if you look at the response of elements of the Scottish press, the Lowland press, in the early 1850s, they condemned the Irish because they had brought the famine upon themselves, and they condemned the Highlander, even though the Highlander was a fellow Scot, for the same reason. Because of this Teutonist madness that started to develop in this period. My theory, therefore, ladies and gentlemen, is this. The racial skeletons were in the Scottish intellectual cupboard, and because of all of these forces that I've described, started to be released, at least by some elements, into the fresh air in the early 1920s, and through that decade into the early 1930s. So that's one possible explanation. Can I just 2 or 3 more minutes? We started slightly late. Briefly, the Irish can now be categorised as an alien race in a legal sense because of the foundation of the Free State in 1922. Big concern on the part of respectable Scottish elements of the extent of IRA activity in Scotland in the period of the Civil War and immediately before it. On 3 different occasions, members of the Army Council crossed to Scotland to review their troops, reckoned to be about 6,500 strong, on Fenwick Moor on the border of Lanarkshire and Ayrshire. Eamon de Valera himself said that the greatest source not only of funding, not of funding, which would have almost certainly been the USA, but of gelignite and powder for the Scottish coal mines. And so there was a sense among certain elements of Scotland that they were the enemy within. And the barbarity of the Civil War seemed to legitimise in the views of these elements the fact that the Irish were indeed a barbarous and inferior race. And finally, the Catholic Church in Scotland seemed to be on the march. Its numbers were increasing rapidly, partly because of higher birth rates, compared to the loss of confidence in the Protestant churches after World War I. There was a sense, and it is extraordinary to reflect upon it nowadays, but there was a sense among certain serious commentators that Scotland was on the way to becoming an Irish Catholic state. George Malcolm Thompson, who then went on in later years to become fairly rational and a newspaper man with Lord Beaverbrook's newspapers in London, published a book in 1936 called Caledonia, or The Eclipse of the Scots. And it involves the story of a New Zealander who comes to Edinburgh in the year 2017. And in that text, Princess Street in Edinburgh, Scotland's, if you like, main thoroughfare, is capped at the far end by an enormous cathedral, an enormous Catholic cathedral. And when he arrives in the centre of Edinburgh, the first thing he experiences is the extraordinary and deep smell of incense. As the Archbishop, who of course then, because of the extent of Catholic power, is also a cardinal, the various hierarchies, hundreds of altar boys are moving down in procession to celebrate the triumph of pan-Scottish dominance. I don't know whether it was a bestseller or not, but it certainly was published in the 1930s. Professor Andrew Dewar Gibb, Professor of Constitutional Law at the University of Edinburgh, one of the first Scottish nationalists. We are being slowly overtaken by an alien race who are responding to the views of their magic men. Magic men being the priests, of course. And you know, that is from a university professor, which shows that got to be very careful what university professors say. The only other element in the story is the fear among very conservative-minded elements in Scottish society. I mean that with a capital C politically, but also social with a small c. There had been a tremendous victory for the Labour Party in the early 1920s. A tremendous victory, if you like, for left-wing politics, as we would call it. And these conservative elements, clearly demonstrated in the Scottish press at the time, thought that this was due to the enemy within, because most of the Catholic immigrants had just got the vote in 1918. And what was the first result? They send dozens of Red Clydeside MPs to Westminster, who, to quote one newspaper, are a moral disgrace to this nation, unquote. Right, so the long and the short of it is that despite this, I think now generally regarded as a fairly horrific period in Scottish history, the bigots did not win. They did not. The government refused to act, because how could they act against the dominion of the British Empire in terms of curtailing immigration? Secondly, the statistics of the Church of Scotland turned out to be seriously flawed. And in one of the noblest acts of Scottish journalism, an anonymous writer who I've been unable to track down his name, 5 large articles in 1929 in what was the House Journal of the West of Scotland business and professional classes, the Glasgow Herald. In 5 long articles, he demonstrated very factually and soberly the nonsense claims of the Church of Scotland about an increasing Irish migration, demonstrating really from census evidence that this was not the case, and in fact the reverse was the case. Not one Scottish political party linked any part of the programme to the cause of the Kirk or these local sectarian parties, either Liberal, Conservative or Labour. And that's very interesting as well, because the Conservative Party in Scotland had a very considerable linkage with the Orange Order, but even then it didn't act. And of course, when the horrors of the Second World War became apparent, ethnic discrimination, ethnic hatred of this type was very much marginalised in Scotland. So you begin to see from the 1950s the Church of Scotland changing its attitude. 1982, the Pope himself, on his first visit of a Pope to Scotland, met the officers of the General Assembly under the statue, the frowning statue of John Knox at New College in Edinburgh. When he preached a mass in Bellahouston Park in Edinburgh, in Glasgow, it was the largest multitude ever assembled in Scotland, and that included also people who were not of the Catholic faith. But the long-term results of the interwar crisis should not be forgotten, because one of the serious long-term effects, one of the serious consequences which had a degree of duration, was the statement by the Church, both at national, the Presbyterian Church, both at national and local level, that it was morally acceptable and indeed advisable to give Scots in these depressed conditions first entry to the jobs rather than these immigrant aliens. And right through until the late 60s and early 70s in Scotland, fully documented by modern historical and sociological research, systematic discrimination against Catholics was especially strong in some parts of the heavy industries, in banking, in accountancy, and one or two other areas. I leave you with this peculiar anecdote. My father was a graduate. I am from that background. I'm third generation immigrant from my mother's side, Cavan, and my father's side, County Donegal. My father was one of the first from that immigrant group to go to university, went to Glasgow University in the 1930s. He taught all his life in Scottish schools. My brother was applying for a job in the big, on the staff. There's usually very little difficulty then about artisan, craftsman jobs, tradesman jobs in these steelworks. But he was applying for a job because he was becoming a trainee accountant in Colville's Limited, which was the biggest employer in the Motherwell area, a huge steel corporation. And my father, who knew the scene, consciously advised him not to put Our Lady's High School, where he'd been educated, on his form, but Motherwell High School, in a vain attempt, as it turned out, because the first question that James was asked during the interview was, what boys' brigade company did you belong to?
Well, when I listen to you, I know why I like history. That was terrific. Before we open for questions, and I'm sure there are going to be some, I'd like to acknowledge a visitor here today, Pat Kelleher-Watley, who is here from University of Dundee, and she is going around to a number of universities, number of places. Dundee has an archive of wonderful photographs taken by, what is his name?
Michael Pito.
Yes, including some as yet unseen Beatles photographs. So thank you for being with us, and we'll open for questions. Yes.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, was there any impact of, given the prominent role that Scottish people played in the British Empire, was there any impact of from that on these racial ideas among people who were colonial administrators or had interactions with Indians, anything like that? Did that have any impact on these sorts of ideas?
You could certainly speculate that it could very well have done for the reason that you've given, because the Scottish over-representation, especially at elite level, administrator, military officer, merchant, professional, whether it be teacher or physician, was absolutely massive. In shorthand terms, the old aphorism that England ruled the empire but the Scots ran it is broadly correct. And that had been going on since the early years of the 18th century. Now, given the extent of that sense almost of, how would one put it, sometimes even racial superiority, it would be difficult to leave that kind of thing out of an explanation. But getting a rigorous correlation with it is, as you can imagine, quite difficult. It's especially difficult because a lot of these people who did work out there, especially in the period during and immediately after the Great Scottish Enlightenment of the 18th century, were kind of relativists. If you take the person who's usually regarded as one of the main founders of modern sociology, John Miller, and when he looked at this, and some of his fellow literati felt the same. There are stages in man's development. One should not criticise primitive people because they're at a different stage, because they will eventually move from the stage of hunters and fishermen, through to agriculturalists and then to the commercial stage, etc. And that gave some of the Scottish imperial elites a kind of sympathetic attitude We now know from the work of people like Martha McLaren on India and others on New Zealand that, and even to some extent in the late 18th century on the American Indian, but we now know that, especially in India, a lot of the legislation during the Raj had strong elements of Scottish Enlightenment thinking in it, which tried to take on board elements of the existing systems and not in any sense sweep them aside. And some of these individuals became great Persian and other linguistic scholars, in the field. They didn't exactly go native totally, but there was almost a kind of sense in which they became intellectually native. So what I'm really saying is it's very difficult to generalise. But then if you go to the other extreme, then you can see certainly, take Australia, cleared out Highlanders, cleared out Gaels, especially during the famine period. Many of them were conveyed by ship to the Australian colonies and became internationally renowned for their treatment of the Aborigines. So it was probably the same thing happened with the Irish, but a bitter irony, these people and their surviving correspondence shows deeply racist views. Although those views may well have been simply conveyed by the realities of the fact that they wanted the land of these people. So the correlations should be mentioned, but it cannot be rigorously assessed, especially in terms of the difficulty of generalisation.
Can I follow up? Just a couple questions about, you mentioned the founding of the Free State fed into some of the resentment. First question was, do you know if the British troops who were in the War of Independence, do you know if they were, there was a lot of Scottish representation, groups like the Black and Tans?
Yeah.
And then the second one was there any kind of backlash in World War II against the neutrality of the Irish in the war?
Take the first one first because it suddenly resonates with me. My grandfather, who was a first-generation immigrant, regularly listened to the broadcasts of Lord Haw-Haw. Do you know who this is? It was hanged at the end of William Joyce. He was hanged at the end of the Second World War for sending his classic call sign was Germany calling, Germany calling. And my grandfather, who did have certain political views, for example, hatred of Churchill and others, because the way he behaved with the miners during the 1920s. Really seriously believe what Lord Haw-Haw was saying, well, he didn't actually use the word Brits, but what he meant was the Brits are going to be beaten. So there were elements, probably elements like that among the expatriate community. Surprisingly little. I mean, clearly there is some evidences of people in that lingering extreme area after 1945 who would easily be able to use that kind of evidence. The classic one was De Valera, going to the Book of Condolence at the German embassy and that sort of thing. I mean, whatever the rationale for it, when you think of the way that the people of Britain had suffered during the Second World War, they would have been, in some sense, unhuman if they hadn't reacted powerfully to something like that. But there's no evidence really of a strong backlash because of that. And then if you go to the other one, nobody has ever worked out, to my knowledge anyway, on the Scottish side of the academy, the proportion of Scottish regiments which served both in the Black and Tans, and in the garrison, say 1916, etc. I don't think there's very much evidence, for example, in Dublin, of Scottish soldiery in 1916. But I do know that because we do have some correspondence of elements of the Scots who served in Ireland during the later period. The reputation of the Scottish soldier is that he is heroic, which undeniably is, given the battle honours. But he's also ferocious. He's also ruthless, and it's quite obvious that these were important qualities during the Black and Tan era.
There's a question at the back, and then I'll come to you. Yes? No?
Yes, if I may, thank you. I should probably declare myself myself. I'm the British Consul General in Boston, so I run a little bit of empire here.
Have I said anything anti-British?
Not at all.
And if so, can I claim immunity?
Not at all, and I greatly enjoyed your remarks. I'm
Thank you.
here primarily in a private capacity because I was interested in what you had to say.
Right.
What I wanted to ask was this: you talked about I'm not quite using your words, but the traditional indigenous Catholic society
Yeah.
at the time. I'm interested to know what their reaction was to the General Assembly's position. Did they protest publicly? Did they keep their heads down?
Right.
Or did they somehow distinguish themselves from the immigrants who were coming at that time?
Right. Now, the fascinating thing here is that the general attitude, and it was the general attitude I would say right through possibly to the notorious Macmillan speech at the the Edinburgh International Festival. You know about that, do you?
No, I don't.
Well, in I wouldn't say he's Scotland's greatest composer, but he's certainly Scotland's greatest younger composer, James Macmillan, who comes from that background, that ethnic background, used his, important cultural individuals are asked to give a speech at the Edinburgh International Festival every year. Curiously, he used his speech not as a platform for music, but to denounce what he called Scotland's shame. That was the title of the lecture. And it was like Pandora's box opening. Because he basically said that even although there have been changes, Scotland is still a profoundly anti-Catholic society. Even most Catholics thought he was exaggerating. But it led to the most incredible correspondence in the press. And because of it, I was approached by senior people in the Church of Scotland and by the then Cardinal Tom Winning, who was the head of the Catholic Church in Scotland, to get a book together very quickly indeed from academic authors and one or two others to try and determine what was the reality. And that is the title of the book that Ruth Ann has referred to. It's called Scotland's Shame, but with a question mark: Bigotry and Sectarianism in Modern Scotland. And it was produced within about 8 months from Macmillan's speech. It was what is called instant academic analysis. So the general attitude until then was really keep the head down. And that was the attitude during the 1920s and 1930s. I know of, there might have been odd letters going into the press and that sort of thing, but certainly the Catholic Church's view was just, steady. Don't try and stir this up. Pull back. And of course, if this policy had led to anything serious, then there could have been a different response. As far as the indigenous Catholic population is concerned, mainly concentrated in that corridor from Barra and Benbecula in the Outer Isles, right across the Hebridean Sea to Arisaig and Moidart on the western mainland, and with some elements in the northeastern counties of Aberdeen and Banff. They certainly didn't have racist attitudes to the incomers. Somebody's phoning me from Scotland, so I better put this off. They certainly didn't have racist attitudes towards the incomers, but they didn't welcome them either. And it's interesting that members of the Scottish Catholic hierarchy for many years were from that background. And you find now that the private correspondence has been revealed, their deep concern that there were far too many Irish priests coming to Scotland into parishes. As one bishop said, Father Murphy, if he reads anything, only reads, and probably only has read through his entire 40-year career in this, the Court Advertiser. So that there was that. Do you mind if I answer this?
Do you want to ask what first?
Sorry?
Do you want, you have a question?
That's all I can say on that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes.
My question is a curious one. During that mass migration time frame, I'm curious as to the Irish point of view. Did the Irish at that time feel that going to Glasgow and Edinburgh was a much better opportunity for them than, say, Liverpool or Manchester, which were similar as far as their industrial
Yeah.
capacities?
My feeling is that, I can't tell, but what I can tell is that they did certainly see a differentiation between coming to Scotland and going to America.
Right.
Yeah, because there's definite evidence of a substantial leakage, as you would say, of people who came really to make a bit of money in order to eventually get away from Scotland. You see, the irony is that two things. The irony is that Scotland's industrial success, one of the reasons why it was so ephemeral, is because it was based essentially on a low-wage economy. The average wages, real wages, if you compare Glasgow with Manchester, two big industrial centres, probably even as late as the First World War, about 20% in favour of Manchester. The housing problem in Scotland in 1914 was horrendous, and yet this was arguably, in quote marks, one of the second richest nation on earth at that time. And it was based really around a low-wage system. And I think, given the wage differentiation between the USA labour market and the Scottish labour market, there is no doubt that many immigrants from Ireland regarded America as the final land of opportunity to which they would eventually migrate. Of course, not all did so. But the second thing I would say about it is that, as far as we can tell, that the connections were geographical. In other words, that I used to, when I taught undergraduates, ask a typical West of Scotland second year class in Scottish history to raise their hands if they knew where they had come from, and most of them would do. And say, how many from can you trace your lineage back to Ireland? The typical response would be maybe a quarter of the class. And then if you know where you came from, was it anywhere outside the quadrant of, especially the Catholic dimension, if it was anything outside the quadrant of Sligo, North Fermanagh, Donegal and Western Cavan, you would target inundate. So it was very, very, very localised, because the boat was often the Derry boat that we came on, and some of them would but the Protestant migration was equally localised, because overwhelmingly they came from Antrim and down. So that suggests that it's the geographical connections and the chain migration systems which are built into them, rather than them saying, is Preston better than Motherwell, that sort of thing, unless they had maybe connections there. But there was no doubt about it, they did make a difference on the whole. We know this from the correspondence being analysed in the Research Institute at Aberdeen. They did make a difference between American prospects and British prospects.
I think if there isn't another question, we'll let Professor Devine answer his. And we do invite you, there are drinks out here. I'm sorry it's not whiskey, but there's a beer